Okay. Okay, Andrew, so welcome again, and looking forward for your webinar. So if you want to do a short introduction of your topic, that would be great. The question is, would you like to be interrupted during the conversation, or would you like to just tell us about what you are going to talk about and then have some question time?
I'm quite happy to be interrupted if anybody has something they want to throw into the discussion. Otherwise, of course, yeah, I'm happy to discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much. So it's all yours.
My pleasure. Okay, well, I'm Andy Pickering. To introduce myself, my field is Science and Technology Studies, STS, we call it. It's a bit like history, philosophy, and sociology of science. I've written about everything from particle physics to, more recently, cybernetics. I'm a retired professor these days at the University of Exeter. Before that, for a long time, we were at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, for many years. I appreciate very much Angela's invitation to speak in this distinguished series. Thank you to everybody for showing up. I'm glad to see some familiar faces all squashed up on this little screen. I haven't got any pictures to show you, so I'm afraid it's just going to be me talking for the next 40 minutes or something like that. Yes, I'll try pulling a few funny faces as we go along to make it entertaining. I'm going to talk this afternoon about cybernetics crisis. How can we react to the perils of the Anthropocene? Global warming, species extinctions, environmental disasters, things like that. I should say right away at the start that I don't have any quick answers to the problems of the Anthropocene, but I want to talk about an important but unfamiliar, largely unrecognized pattern of action that I call acting with the world, which I think can help ameliorate at least some of the problems of the Anthropocene by coupling humanity into nature differently. Or suggests a new way forward. So acting with is my topic. I want to say what it is, what I mean. I want to show that it exists, why it's important, and I want to establish its connections with cybernetics. And any feedback on this is very valuable to me. Once upon a time, the environmental crisis was high on the list of cybernetic concerns, thanks mainly to Gregory Bateson, of course. But it's since slipped down the agenda relative to topics like organizations and management, a la Metaphourm, and language and ethics, a la second order cybernetics, and Pillar Bonnell's last talk in this series. My hope is to push the environment back up the batting order. I think we need to do that. I'll start with Bateson and then I'll turn to my own thoughts, drawing on an example from my forthcoming book, Acting with the World, Floods, Farming, Fires and Spirits, which is currently in press with Duke University Press. That's the advertising bit. I've been having second thoughts about the title. Currently, it's Acting with the World, which isn't very striking. I discussed this with Paul by email. I'm thinking of changing the title to something like Agency in the Anthropocene. I don't know what you think about that. If anybody has any reactions, tell me after the talk, maybe. Oh, right, 1 thumbs up. That's a very good start. Okay, I know Bateson best for his work on schizophrenia in the 1950s. I've written about that. But later in his life, Bateson became greatly concerned with the environmental crisis. And we can begin with his cybernetic analysis of what the problem was and is. In 1967, in the Summer of Love, Bateson spoke at the Dialectics of Liberation Congress held at the Roundhouse in London. Those were the days. The title of his talk was Conscious Purpose versus Nature. And in it, he made several important moves. First, he ontologized cybernetics, so to speak. Cybernetics, of course, is more or less defined by its interest in feedback loops. And Bateson went one step further by insisting that nature itself, the world itself, is a swarming tangle of feedback loops, collectively holding each other in check. Back in the 1950s, Stafford Beer had defined cybernetics as the science of exceedingly complex systems. That was his phrase, meaning ungraspable assemblages that science somehow bounces off. And Bateson's swarming loops brought Beer's vision of complexity to life, so to speak. Interestingly, ecosystems were missing from Beer's list of exceedingly complex systems: the brain, the firm, and the economy. No one worried very much about the environment back in the 1950s. Bateson's second move in his talk in 1967 was to point to the impossibility of what he called lineal control of this feedback world. He noted that we can indeed act on such a world by changing some of its parameters or adding or subtracting elements. But instead of a calculable cause and effect relationship, the upshot would depend unpredictably on variables growing or shrinking in the interplay of loops until a new equilibrium might emerge. Bateson thus pictured an uncontrollable world as the other side of his cybernetic ontology. Already in the 1950s, in his work on schizophrenia, Bateson tried to bring home this point about the impossibility of control by comparing it with trying to reverse a truck with two treads, something you basically can't do. That was his ontology. The complication that comes up here, namely, that we actually do seem to have some degree of lineal control over the world. Antibiotics, for example, are remarkable to treat microbial infections. Describing modern medicine sarcastically as, quote, a bag of tricks, some of them very valuable tricks. We do tricks in the world, but we fail to understand the complex systems that they're acting in. This struck me when I read it as a rather weak move, conceptually and rhetorically. But in 1970, 3 years later, Bateson went further, arguing, in effect, that these tricks are themselves dangerous. Today, think of antibiotic, of what he had in mind. But Bateson's example was the one on everybody's mind back in those days, the use of DDT as a pesticide. DDT does, in fact, kill insects. Using DDT is a good trick in that sense. However, as Rachel Carson famously showed in her 1962 bestseller, Silent Spring, DDT also does something else at the same time. It kills songbirds. Generally, we could add several more elements to the analysis. Well, even when successful, our attempts at lineal control of nature, our tricks, are imperfect and imprecise. This is what we have to expect in dealing with exceedingly complex systems. 2, this imperfection often takes the form of what I call a performative excess, in which unintended side effects, like killing songbirds, come along with successful tricks like killing insects. The tricks echo unpredictably through complex ecosystems and resurface in unexpected ways in unexpected places. And 3, we can see this excess as what I think of as the dark side of lineal control. Silent Spring as the dark side of pesticide use. Global warming as the dark side of fossil fuels. The Anthropocene as the dark side of all the tricks we've invented to control nature. And this point, I think, is worth emphasizing. The environmental horrors of the Anthropocene, global warming, species extinctions, wildfires, floods, and not just bad luck playing itself out in history. These horrors are the necessary complement of the coin of our mastery of nature. And as our mastery grows, so do the horrors. In his great book, The Railway Journey, my friend Wolfgang Schivelbusch pointed to what he called the increasing falling height of modern technology. The greater the powers we possess, the greater the wreckage and fail. And if you want a recent example of that, think of that enormous container ship knocking over the bridge in Baltimore Harbor. The ship was called the Dali, after Salvador Dali, I suppose. The Disaster is a surrealist masterpiece. This afternoon, I was thinking about the situationists.
Andrew, it seems to be that we are losing you again. It's going backwards and forwards. Perhaps if we try without the image, if you switch off your video.
Yeah, sure. How much of that did you lose?
Yeah.
If you don't know. What was the last thing I said?
No, it's been mostly all right, but there's been bits in which is difficult to follow. So let's try without the video, and then when we open the conversation, we'll ask you to come back to put the video on. Okay?
Right. Okay. So
Okay.
my video is gone. Everybody else is still there, of course.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right. So I was saying something about the situationists wanting to puncture the surface of everyday reality. And I think that ship knocking over the bridge in Baltimore Harbor, perfect situationist event, reminding us of what the world is really like. Well, that was a bit on the dark side of the Anthropocene. And that's my basic understanding of Gregory Bateson's vision of the environmental crisis. A vision grounded in an ontology of squirming feedback loops, which can be controlled to some extent, but always with unintended consequences as a possible dark side. This is the cybernetic analysis of the environmental crisis we now call the Anthropocene. Is it working okay now? Can you?
Yes, perfect. Yes, go on.
Each continuous?
Yes, yes.
All right, so that's the cybernetic problematic. So what? So Bateson's analysis was right, but where does it get us? How should we react? I never had chance to ask the great man himself, but the answer in his writings is that we think differently. In the modern West, we think dualistically. We think of humanity as not just separate from the rest of creation, but in control and in command. That's what the tricks Bateson wrote about are all about. And Bateson's own prescription was that we need somehow to get past dualist thinking and recognize that we're part of nature and entangled with it. I have to say that I find this unsatisfying. If dualist patterns of thought were the problem, any academic philosophy department could easily solve it. No one sticks up for dualist philosophy these days. But what if we do think different? What then? What should we do? How might we act out this different pattern of thought in our relations with nature and the environment? What should we do? There's no obvious answer to this question, and Bateson himself came up characteristically short here. As in his earlier work on madness, he was unwilling to offer any practical advice to follow through on his cybernetic analysis. I think he assumed that such advice must involve giving recipes for lineal control, which was, of course, the problem in the first place. And so, at last, this is where I would like to come into the discussion. The book I mentioned before, which might be called Acting with the World, is my attempt to exemplify and document ways of not just thinking differently, but acting differently. The emphasis is on action. I've become fascinated with the ways of engaging with the environment that don't act out fantasies of dualist control, but instead foreground a recognition that nature is indeed one of Stafford Beer's exceedingly complex systems. And my book runs through a series of examples of what I call acting with nature rather than acting on it. Ways which, following Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, I call poesis rather than what he called enframing. Enframing is our usual way of going on, a dominating stance, treating nature as standing reserve for human projects that we all recognize and which has brought us the environmental crisis as its dark side. Poesis is the strange and unfamiliar other way I want to make visible, analyze, and recommend in this talk. To explain what I have in mind, I'll concentrate on just one example and mention some others later on. Okay, my example concerns attempts at restoring the ecosystem of the Colorado River. And the story begins in 1963 with the construction of the Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado, right upstream of the Grand Canyon. We can think of the dam as one of Bateson's tricks of control. It successfully held back large quantities of water in what became Lake Powell, and it generated reliable quantities of electricity as intended. As we should also expect, however, it did more than that at the same time. The dark side of control in this instance was that the downstream ecosystem began to degrade. The dam drastically reduced the amount of sediment carried by the river, with the result that sandbanks eroded, native plants and fish were endangered, and alien species started to move in. However, in 1983, 20 years after the dam was built, an emergency release of large quantities of water from Lake Powell accidentally turned out to address these problems by rebuilding sandbanks and recreating habitats, though only temporarily. And this observation led in turn to what became known as the Glen Canyon Adaptive Management Program, the AMP for short, to see what could be achieved in the longer term in restoring the Colorado's ecosystem. The AMP entailed periodically staging artificial floods by opening the floodgates in the Glen Canyon Dam, monitoring their effects downstream, and recalibrating succeeding floods in the light of observed ecosystem transformations. Again, this achieved beneficial effects, though still only temporary ones. Sandbanks that were rebuilt by each flood later started to erode, and so on. The next step in the AMP, the important next step, centered on two other rivers that enter the Colorado below the Glen Canyon Dam, the Paria and the Little Colorado River. These were the sources of additional sediment, and the new idea was to synchronize artificial floods from Lake Powell with periods when the Paria and the Little Colorado were carrying more sediment, much more sediment than usual, due to heavy rainfall. Sediment which could, in turn, contribute further to restoring the sandbanks on the Colorado. It was incorporated in the operating protocol for the dam, and it works. Though adverse effects continued to reappear between floods, the new protocol succeeded in, quote, rebuilding and maintaining beaches, sandbars, and other environmental resources. A way had been found then of restoring, to a degree at least, the Colorado ecosystem. And it's noting here that, as I've just described, wasn't a once and for all final solution to the problem of environmental degradation, but it was rather a technique to be reapplied through time. These experimental floods, synchronized with the other rivers, have to keep on being staged over the years. All right, that is the bare bones of my story of the AMP. And now I want to examine it from various different angles to try to bring out what I think is interesting and strange about it. One, just the AMP today of acting poesis, proof this thing exists in the world. I call it acting with because it's a pattern of action centered on finding out what nature wants to do by staging experimental floods, in this case, and then tuning ourselves into that by modulating flood profiles and timing, and by gearing together water flows on several rivers, the Colorado, the Paria, and the Little Colorado. And the contrast here, to be clear, is with acting on nature or enframing, imposing our will on the world, come what may, as in plonking down a dam on the Colorado River to turn it into a source of electricity. Enframing is our usual way of going on. We all recognize it. I'm trying to point to poiesis as another way of going that generally goes unrecognized. My second point. We can note that restoring the Colorado ecosystem is a so-called wicked problem. And I talked to Paul a lot about this in the past. In the sense that it's not the sort of thing that scientists and engineers can calculate their way through. In contrast, say, to building a dam, dams are pretty easy to calculate. Correspondingly, the AMP was not a trick of lineal control in Bateson's terms. It was a different pattern of acting in the world, and that's what I want to dwell on. As I said before, and I'll probably say again, Bateson himself always emphasized thinking differently. But in the AMP, the engineers found a way of acting differently, which is both much harder and much more important. 3, I should just emphasize that the AMP has worked in restoring the Colorado ecosystem. In general, I think, poiesis offers us a principled approach to wicked problems that science can't handle, a new way forward. And wicked problems, of course, are everywhere. They're not just problems of the Anthropocene. So it's good to have another way forward. 4, I've described the background to this story in terms of Bateson's environmental cybernetics. But now I want to say why the adaptive management program and poiesis in general is itself cybernetic. At the heart of the AMP is what I call, probably self-explanatory terms, a dance of agency, a back and forth of actions and performances, coupling together the human dam operators and the behavior of 2 or 3 rivers. The engineers do something, releasing massive quantities of water, to find out what the ecosystem will do in response, to which the engineers then tune their subsequent actions, and so on, back and forth throughout the history of the AMP, which is still going on, I should say. And this dance of agency is nothing more than a feedback loop, or a feedback spiral, which is, of course, definitional of cybernetics. I can do this sort of performative back and forth, a spiral of actions rather than words, is what I think we can find running all the way through the history of cybernetics, especially in Britain, from Grey Walter Homestats 98 and cybernetic art and variants of Beer's viable system model and syntegration today. That's the performative skeleton. The dam operators in the AMP, for example, act just like Ashby's homeostat, emitting signals, experimental floods, and reconfiguring themselves in response to whatever comes back to them from the river and the ecosystem. This performative and poetic skeleton of actions by tends to get forgotten. contemporary cybernetics and bring it back to the. I think it should be. So the organizations and governance a la VSM, nor is it about language a la second order cybernetics. To repeat, it's directly about our material relations with nature, our patterns of action in the world, and the world's responsive. That these relations are hard to focus on in cybernetics is, I think, a reflection of the humanism of today's cybernetics. Its determined focus on people and relations between people. The Anthropocene instead calls for a post-humanist and decentered analysis of relations between people and things. Fine. I learned a wonderful word in conversation with Peter Robertson, who's right at the middle of my screen. The world is derailment. Peter's idea is that once upon a time we lived in tune with nature as just another responsive element in the overall complex system of the world. But around 10,000 years ago, with the development of farming and fixed settlements, we started to go off the rails. In Bateson's terms, our linear tricks of control have broken our reciprocal connections with nature, reciprocal connections, thus precipitating what I call the dark side of the Anthropocene. One date for the beginning of the Anthropocene is precisely 10,000 years ago when we began to establish fixed settlement. I think Peter will develop this line of thought in his own way in his talk. But I just want to emphasize that techniques of acting with nature, like the AMP, help put us back on the rails. Exploring how ecosystems react to experimental floods is precisely a way of finding out what nature wants to do, in contrast to imposing our will. And the upshot of the AMP, synchronizing artificial floods on the Colorado with the behavior of the Paria River, in what I call a choreography of human and non-human agency, is precisely a way of plugging ourselves back into the rhythms of nature, as I think Peter might say. I think this image of derailment and getting back on the rails is a very nice way of thinking about what needs to be done more generally in the Anthropocene. Okay, as I said, the AMP is my principal example of poiesis, acting with, today. But I do have other examples, and I now want to run quickly through some of them just to illustrate the range of the argument. It's not only about the Colorado River. All of them hinge on recognizing the agency of nature and acting with it, getting back on the rails. So here's a list. The Mississippi. Throughout the 20th century, the US Army Corps of Engineers, the ACE, has tried to dominate the Mississippi River by pinning it down with levees and control structures. This is one of the world's great projects of enframing and acting on. And as usual, it has had several unintended dark sides, including the fact that trying to contain the Mississippi actually seems to have intensified flooding. But from a different angle, the Mississippi story also includes some examples of poesis. Before the artificial construction of levees and so on, the native Indians inhabited the floodplain nomadically, moving back and forth poetically in response to flooding. They lived on the floodplain, but they moved away when it was underwater and then back again. They acted with the river. They tuned themselves into its rhythms. That's poesis. In the present day, diversions, meaning artificial breaks in the levees, allow river sediment to spill out and recreate land that has been lost to the sea. This amounts to a poetic letting, allowing the agency of nature to repair prior damage. Iatrogenesis is the long word for that kind of thing. Water engineering in the Netherlands. The Mississippi water control measures in the Netherlands over the centuries have proved self-defeating as flooding has become more intense over time. And this has provoked an overall paradigm shift in water engineering from enframing towards poesis, a shift that includes a move to a pre-modern nomadism, like that of the American Indians around the Mississippi. In the so-called Room for the River project, dikes in Holland have been partially removed or moved back from Holland's major rivers so that the land itself now absorbs minor floods, while the farmers oscillate poetically between the floodplains and artificially raised platforms for farmhouses. In the book, I also discuss a major Dutch rewilding project at the Oostvaardersplassen, forgive my pronunciation, which is a polder reclaimed from the sea. The significance of this rewilding project for me is as another instance of letting go, a poetic surrender to non-human agency to find out what it will do, the polar opposite of domination. Natural farming. This is a name for a very interesting do-nothing alternative to conventional farming that rejects weeding, ploughing, flooding, and the use of chemicals. None of those things. It does without all of the usual agricultural techniques. It was developed in Japan after World War II by a chap called Masanobu Fukuoka in a poetic process isomorphous with the AMP on the Colorado, staging a deliberate dance of agency now with the soil, trying out different strategies for redistributing the straw left after threshing, taking advantage of duck droppings to encourage the decomposition of the mulch, experimenting with various techniques to discourage sparrows and rodents, and so on. After several years of this back and forth, this dance settled down into a regular pattern or technique, which is natural farming, in which scattering straw from the previous crop and sowing overlapping summer and winter crops and clover and timed and synchronized, in which that sowing of overlapping summer and winter crops and clover are timed and synchronized with changes in the weather to inhibit weeds and diseases. Another choreography of agency isomorphous with the dam operators on the Colorado. Fire. Ironically, the intensity of recent wildfires around the world, and there's been plenty of those, is partly a spin-off of attempts at fire control. The usual tactic of extinguishing small fires as soon as they break out turns out to lead to the accumulation of combustible material and disasters waiting to happen. Another dark side of enframing. In this context, it's interesting to look at traditional Aboriginal fire techniques in Australia. Their frequent small burns once served to obviate devastatingly large fires, but went much further, tuning their practices into the agency of nature, meaning the wind and the weather, specifics of landscape, wildlife, vegetation. Aborigines traditionally used fire in very productive ways. I didn't used to know them. To modulate the distribution of grass and trees, to encourage the flourishing of desirable animals and birds, to control insects, and so on. Again, a poetic choreography of agency, analogous to the AMP, that restructured and maintained the entire landscape of Australia prior to European settlement. Bill Gammage, who wrote about this, refers to Australia as the biggest estate on earth. He said the Aborigines looked after it like parks back in England. Spirits. To widen the sense of agency, I devoted a chapter of my book to Amazonian shamanism. They're going in a different direction. Using various technologies of the self, including psychedelic drugs, shamans put themselves in a position to communicate with spirits called a zapari by the Yanomami. What interests me here is that both the shaman and the zapari exhibit forms of agency unrecognizable by science or modern common sense, while B has an important symmetry here of human and non-human agency. Unlike our modern asymmetry of the domination and control of nature, shamans are at the mercy of the spirits who can choose to help or harm or even kill them. Shamanism and animism in general is thus once again poetic in tuning into the unpredictable and emergent agency of nature. And following on from this, my semi-serious, possibly even serious suggestion is that we should all become animists. Animism, I reckon, is an excellent standpoint to appreciate both the power and the dark side of enframing, seeing both of those things as connected to one another. Nuclear power stations as temperamental gods. Gaia is the name of a god. I hope that's enough examples, and I think there's plenty to think about there. Now, if I've got time, I want to come at enframing and poiesis from another angle. I've been talking so far about doing things, what we do in the world, what the world does, how these doings relate to and structure one another. To finish, I want to think about something that I haven't mentioned so far, knowledge. First, we think about science. It's meeting nature and gathering work to advance our studying the world. Science is now central to our mastery of the world, but at the same time, it's necessarily bound up with the dark side of mastery, certainly including the environmental crisis. We tend more and more to look to science as the savior of our civilization, the remedy for all our ills, but it's integral to our problems in the first place. It's what's remembering. And it therefore interests me a lot that science is more or less absent from most of my examples of poiesis, rewilding, natural control. They all foreground action. None of them depend on knowledge. They're examples of successfully doing without science. It is a measure of just how strange and unfamiliar the poetic paradigm is. To acknowledge active management of the Colorado River is the one example I've found that does have a noticeable scientific component, including scientific monitoring of the effects of experimental floods and scientific modeling of the phenomena involved. What to say about that? Measuring seems straightforward. You can't see at a glance how the Colorado ecosystem is changing. So measurements and statistics help us keep track of things. Modeling is more interesting. Back when I was a physicist, a very long time ago, I used to think of modeling as a way to pursue the hidden truths of nature. But while modeling is a major component of the AMP, the scientists themselves don't. They themselves are clear that there is much more going on in the world than they can ever recognize and calculate. As Kai Lee, one of the pioneers of adaptive, surprise. Predictions often go wrong, expectations unfulfilled, and warnings hollow. Models from this perspective should thus not be seen as approximations to hidden truths, the way I used to think, but as revisable guides to seeing as better than nothing in trying to grasp exceedingly complex systems. And Stafford Beer had the right idea here, as usual. His vision of the viable system model included all sorts of models and simulations of organizations and their environments. But he spoke of plans and models as continually aborting. That was his phrase, meaning that we should keep track of their performance and modify them or get rid of them when they go wrong. This, I think, is how to put science in its place, as ancillary at most to poiesis. And finally, I want to move to the opposite extreme from science and just note how some non-modern and non-Western concepts can help us to think about a neo-cybernetic approach to the environment. I've already talked a bit about how animism can come in here. Now we can turn to China. First, in his book, The Propensity of Things, François Julien discusses the Chinese concept of shi, S-H-I. I know I'm not pronouncing it right, I say shi, which refers to the tendency or propensity of things to act one way rather than another. And right action on the human side is understood as acting in accordance with the shi of whatever situation one faces. A standard example is the general who exploits the shi of geography and equipment so well that the enemy is powerless and there's no need actually to fight. What remains a bit mysterious and puzzling in Julien's account is just how we can know the she of a given situation. But the example of the AMP suggests an answer. Experimental floods on the Colorado serve to map out the she of the river's ecosystem, its propensities to act this way or that in different conditions. And the dam operators modify their practice accordingly. Right action. The other Chinese concept that comes up here is Wu Wei, W-U-W-E-I, Wu Wei. Wu Wei is usually translated as not doing, and this nicely describes poetic practices like the removal of levees on the Mississippi and the Rhine, as well as Fukuoka's do-nothing approach to farming. But rather than simply a lack of action, I think Wu Wei could also mean abstaining from attempts at what Bateson called lineal control, in favor of the Taoist idea of going with the flow. And again, very simply, Wu Wei, in this sense, strikes me a nice analysis of the choreographies of agency I've talked about. The AMP on the Colorado, natural farming, Aboriginal fire techniques, Amazonian shamanism, all as exploring the flow of becoming and tuning ourselves into it, getting ourselves back on the rails, as Peter might say. Think of Wu Wei and you have the hang of poesis, and vice versa. And that's about it. I've been trying to develop a cybernetic picture of acting with nature that contrasts with our usual dominating pattern of acting on nature, which has brought us all the horrors of the Anthropocene. I find it striking that traditional Chinese thought offers us simple and direct concepts like Shi and Wu Wei for getting the hang of poesis, while modern science and engineering can hardly recognize or give it a name. This just emphasizes for me the strangeness of what's at stake here and its incommensurability with how we usually think and act. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Andrew. Absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I've asked John Walker to facilitate the conversation. He's more of an expert in all these topics than myself. So, John, please.
Yeah, I think I need to be an expert in watching people put their hands up at the moment, which is not too onerous. Okay, Andrew, would you try putting your vision back on again? So
okay.
Okay, great. And if people can click the hand, if you can. Okay, you've got one already. Di Griffiths, go ahead.
You are muted.
Muted.
First, I had the impression that there was already a queue of people with their hands up. Yeah, I'm wondering how Bateson, if he was with us, might defend giving the priority to thinking over action. And I'm thinking that perhaps he might point at capitalist economics with its definition of externalities and classical experimental method with its identification of confounding variables and exclusion of confounding variables. And these ways of thinking in practice exclude the kind of poetic thinking that poetic action that you're talking about, and in that sense lie behind the actions. Now, of course, doing anything about this involves directly addressing a very powerful and ubiquitous consensus that controls our society, and that's a strong personal and strategic reason for not doing it. But if we're taking seriously the idea of poetic action as a way of transforming our world, then we need to take that task on as an enabler for poetic action.
Yes. Hang on a second.
I think we've had a little woo-wee here.
Yeah, I'm not playing for time. I just realized I forgot to plug my computer in. Yeah, I mean, I think about thinking that what you said is right in all sorts of ways. We think dualistically. We think of the world as a place that we can know and dominate, and certainly a lot of economic knowledge is like that. And we teach our children to think of the world dualistically as a kind of subject in principle to lineal control. And Bateson was quite right to point all those things out. I agree entirely. Anybody can figure that out. What's really difficult to figure out is, so what? What are we going to do about it? And how should we act? I mean, there's millions of academics all around me. What's wrong with dualistic thinking? What a mistake it is. But it strikes me that nobody seems to think about how we could act differently. Really, that is the difficult problem. And funnily enough, I got the inspiration for this by thinking about the British cyberneticians and becoming fascinated, not with their waffling about feedback and circular causality, but the way they brought these ideas down to earth. That was the brilliance of Walter, Ashby, Beer, Pass, Bates.
Yeah. No, I agree. If I can just very quickly come back, I agree. What I'm implying, I suppose, is that some of the big issues that confront. I mean, one of the things I'm most concerned about is seeds and genetic diversity.
Yeah.
You know, like doing something like that in a poetic initiative such as yours might be to remove all intellectual property rights over all biological organisms and seeds. But this requires a degree of political analysis, engagement, and a mass movement, which is sort of way beyond the kind of initiatives carried out in dams. Now, this is not a criticism of your talk at all. It's just a kind of, it worries me, this huge jump between the local action and these wider actions, which are determined by the ideologies and ways of thinking that we live in. Sorry, I've stopped now to keep out of the way of everyone else.
You're right, and you're making a good point. You know, to speak for myself, there are already a favor of that.
Andrew, we lost the last. Can you start again? We lost pretty much everything you were saying the last minute or so.
I was agreeing with the previous comment, but I was saying there are plenty of movements in the world trying to change that kind of macroeconomic setup or whatever. I'm trying to operate at a different level. I'm trying to help people understand that there are other ways of acting, and I want them to understand that the world isn't the sort of place they were taught when they were school children, to open up a new front, if you like. If people understood that this pattern of action was there, they would think about how to go on in all sorts of different situations, which I can't specify in advance for you.
Okay, thank you. And Carlos, you have a question?
Hi, hello. It's well, I was going to wait till the end for just thanking Mr. Andrew for his book. I read it. I love it. It was great inspiration, and hearing some stories there, I could relate to some of the stories in the book. And about the discussion that what was having place right now, I believe that the answer to the problems like the seeds, for example, which is well, I'm a software designer, by the way, and we're creating a product for all the food industry, from the fields to the restaurants and the retailing, and we use the VSM as a model. So I think the problem is already being solved. We hear a lot about decentralization. We hear stuff like key line design for the water, taken from the Colorado River example. And I believe, this is my belief, that we are just a cybernetic layer of software away from really not decentralizing, but having balance, which I believe is the question between decentralization and centralization, which is the whole business of cybernetics, right? And an equilibrium in that. That I just wanted to add that as a belief that it's already happening, and we should design tools for people to experience a different kind of thinking and a different kind of acting in their socioeconomic ways, right? And that will take us there, because I don't believe in the whole blockchain technology just solving, because it's pretty far from our economic centralization right now. So I believe Cybernet is the answer in between those two extremes, per se. Yeah.
Yes.
And thank you very much. That's...
The sound wasn't, your sound is like my vision. It wasn't terribly clear. I agree with you. You can find plenty of examples of this kind of poetic form of development in the world of software. I think I just want to emphasize that the kind of that I was trying to emphasize is between us and the material world.
Marcus, you have a question?
Yes. Thank you very much, Andrew. Your presentation was fascinating and stimulating. And I refer especially to your 5 examples, Mississippi, ANP, etc., etc. I see a lot of collections of examples, and case studies of cybernetically inspired or sustainability inspired procedures or actions. Now, I think that your collection of these 5 examples is precious. And it's precious and it's unmatched. So I would like to read it. When is your book coming out?
Next spring, probably.
In 1 year, huh?
Yeah, it's okay. A slow business.
Can one read the example somewhere else?
Yes, if you send me an email, I'll send you the whole thing.
Oh, that's very kind. We'll do that. Thank you.
Okay, Angela.
Thank you, Andrew. I was fascinated as well with your talk, and something that I felt very, 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 very enthusiastic about and very excited about is to try to understand the indigenous knowledge and wisdom. And I did have the opportunity to do an experience with one of my students in Colombia of trying to apply the VSM to the governance system of an Amazon indigenous group. And it was fascinating to understand when we were trying to map the different roles and the different mechanisms that they use to sort of govern themselves, to understand the relevance of the shamans, no, and the relevance of their beliefs to sort of keep in peace and in harmony with nature. And I was thinking, listening to you, that perhaps one of the problems that we have with current science is that science has broken the link that traditional civilizations have between information, knowledge, and wisdom. And it made me think a lot about Stafford, because Stafford has a paper that is in Think Before You Think, in the compilation of works of his life, and that is called Strength, in which he makes the connection between wisdom and information, knowledge, and wisdom. And I guess, I don't know if you agree, but it seems to me that one of the problems we may have with common science is that that the traditional wisdom has been broken, because it's not possible to validate it scientifically with the scientific methods. Therefore, it's discarded, and that is taking us to lose a lot of this connection that people used to have with nature is broken, as you say. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with it. Absolutely, from several angles. I mean, I guess I was trying to be provocative, but I want to take shamanism seriously. I want to say that the shaman really does have this connection with nature, which is not anything described by modern physics. The funny thing is, of course, that, to become a shaman, apart from anything else, you have to take a whole load of psychedelic drugs, ayahuasca, which puts you in precisely the wrong position to speak scientifically. The paradigmatic scientist is, of course, completely insensible in a state like we are on this screen. So it's very hard to square those two things. The other thing that I would kind of throw in here is this word wisdom. It's an word. It's lurked in the margin of the philosophy of science for years and years. It sounds like wisdom is some kind of knowledge, right? I would like to connect the wisdom and the state into the world performatively, rather than something articulated that's in your head. Yeah, I like that idea.
It's more the result of our experience with the world than the result of our reading of the world, or the information that we collect about the world, or the speeches and theories that we discuss. Is more the way that we experience emotionally and spiritually the world, isn't it?
Well, I wonder if it's experience. I mean, I have arguments with people who talk about skill, as if the poesis and skill were somehow the same thing. Skill is something you possess. Information is something you possess. Whereas I'm trying to use the word to point to a relationship between and the non-human, or possibly between humans and other humans too. It's a state, it's a process.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, okay.
Jose, your turn.
Thanks very much, Joe. Well, Andrew, the first thing is I wish to congratulate you for the presentation and the speech that is so enlightening. For me, it's a huge pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you in person through the technology. I have two observations. One is a small joke. And the small joke is when I first met and found your existence. And this was with your book, I don't know if it can be the Cybernetic Brain. That is your book that discovered me, your existence. And also it discovered me that my city, Valladolid, is in Mexico. This is a small joke I make, Andrew, in the references. I think that Andrew disappeared from the screen. It's down in the bottom. Because I don't see your image, Andrew. Well, anyway, I don't know if you are hearing what I'm saying. Also, Andrew has the micro switched off.
Oh yeah, he's muted.
I think that he lost the connection.
Andrew, can you hear us? Oh, I think we might have lost him altogether.
Well,
should we give it a minute or two?
yeah, let's give it a
No,
minute.
but these were observations for him, and a question to Andrew. No, the joke is that he mentioned in the book, he mentions the work of, among others, of Stafford Beer. And he makes a quotation of the last speech of Beer, that is when he received the doctorate honoris causa in Valladolid. And the joke to Andrew is that he, in the reference in the book, places the University of Valladolid in Mexico. And I told them that I love Mexico, but Valladolid is in Spain. So we are in Spain. It's fantastic, and probably the University of, I don't know if there is a university with the same name in Mexico. Anyway, this was a small joke to him, to ask him if in the next edition, because he told me that he was going to make a second edition, that when he made the second edition, he replaces us to our location in Spain. I made another joke that was referring to the English people, but this I have to tell him the joke to him personally when he is connected, because it doesn't make sense to the rest of the people. Anyway, and the other, it was a question to him about a publication that he did in the 1986 that was very fascinating for me. And the title, it was something like Science as Alchemy. Science as Alchemy. It seems that he came back. No, I don't see him, no.
Oh, I think he's gone altogether.
Still is not connected. Anyway, well, I was going to ask him about this paper and to expand a little bit the ideas of science as alchemy, because it has a lot to see with what he was commenting. That is the way of acting with nature. This means acting with many other disciplines in interventions that are so complex. It is necessary that people from different approaches, mathematics, political sociology, anthropology, etc., etc., etc. And so this paper of Science as Alchemy was very fascinating for me, because it was, hello, Andrew, now you are back. Thanks God.
Sorry. Okay.
I was speaking to your clone, the virtual clone.
Yes.
So, well, the first thing was the joke that I did in the when you made the publication of the book, The Cybernetic Brain. You remember I wrote you because you placed Valladolid in Mexico. I love Mexico, of course, but Valladolid was in Spain. When Beer came, he came to Spain, to Valladolid here, where I am. So this was, and you told me, the next edition, I will put Valladolid in Spain. Thanks very much, Andrew, for positioning me in my native country. Anyway, I insist. I love Mexico and I love Colombia. Angela is from Colombia. all America. No? What can I say? No? But this was just the small joke. The other point that is connected to your speech, it was a paper that I found from you that was from the 1986. And it was mentioned in the title Science as Alchemy. And this is, for me, was very fascinating because I think in your speech that calls for acting with nature implies acting with all kinds of disciplines, mathematics, anthropology, sociology, politics, etc. So alchemy was the science of holistic science, if we can use the word. It was not a discipline, it was not chemistry, it was not physics, etc. So your paper is really fantastic. So could you expand a little bit on this so beautiful idea that you wrote back in the 86?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was now interested in alchemy as a kind of way of going on that thematizes the interconnection of people and things. I think of alchemy as kind of non-dualist, because the process of doing alchemy transforms matter into the philosopher's stone or lead into gold, and at the same time it transforms the human alchemist, eventually leading to enlightenment, maybe union with God or something like that. So people and things being collectively transformed in the process. My argument when I was writing about the history of science, say my book, The Manual of Practice, was that actually science is like that. In the physics laboratory, scientists do things that have never been done with matter before, and at the same time, in a rather mundane way, become new kinds of people, knowing new things, new groupings and stuff like that. The funny thing about the scientists is they don't know that they're coupled to the material world in that way, and they probably don't know because they don't have any language, because they speak a dualistic language in which people and things are completely different. And that's why I'm interested in the history of particle physics to the history of cybernetics, because in some way, cybernetics, especially as it developed in Britain, foregrounds the coupling of them. And here I think of, machine being coupled together alchemically, one might say, that is an artistic performance. How's that?
Could we say, Andrew, this is also a half joke. Could we say that we as cyberneticians are the new alchemists? When I talk to my friends that come from sociology, from politics, economics, etc., I tell them that they are very specialized in their specific fields and their boundaries. But we as cyberneticians, we don't have boundaries as such. So we cross over different disciplines. So we are the new alchemists. Can we use that word? This is a joke, of course.
Well, it's kind of a joke. Of course, if you really wanted to be an alchemist, you'd have to talk about the whole spiritual connection of cybernetics, transforming the self as in the process of being in the world, which of course takes us straight to Stafford Beer and his interest in Indian spirituality and tantric yoga and things like that. I don't think being, anti-disciplinary, which is what we could say about cybernetics in general, quite makes you into an alchemist. Should we say it's a step in the right direction?
Okay, thank you. And John Lee, you've been waiting very patiently.
No, I'm not a patient person. I give a talk. I give a talk as Antoine Lavoisier on how he invented chemistry, and your representation of the alchemist is accurate. If you go back to 1776, the first time Lavoisier saw the oxygen theory of combustion, he was destroying Aristotle's air, earth, fire, and water. So that paradigm went to a new paradigm. But in doing that, alchemy was the transition point in a way that in the previous conversation, you were arguing that cybernetics is now serving that function in society today to try and transition. The problem we have is we're so obsessed with technology, it's destroying our society, it's destroying our planet, and we're obsessed with doing it more. And so we need a positive feedback loop that stops the technology and prioritizes. And the language we're using is analog versus digital. We need to go back to analog language instead of being obsessed with the digital language, which is an attempt to represent nature, but it's a gross misrepresentation. The last point I want to make is Stafford introduced me to the word inexorable, and I recently bumped into it enough that I learned where it comes from. It comes from the word exhort. And the word exhort means to talk your way out of a problem as though it no longer exists, which is what the Democrats in the United States do all the time. The problem is with a problem still there, you talk your way out of it, but it's still there. An inexorable problem is one that's going to evolve until it hits you in the face and there's nothing you can do to talk your way out of it. We need to have the cybernetic language to be able to describe all the problems of the Anthropocene and get technology back where society and nature are running the world, because nature bats last. Your talk was really good, but we only heard half of it. There were many sentences where the key words were left out. You need to give us a printed copy of your talk because it was so good. I'm an expert on the Colorado River. I was looking at it. You're doing a great job. Your work is really important, but we couldn't understand half of what you said. Thank you.
Thanks.
Elena.
You only heard half of my words.
No, it was a bit more than half, don't worry. Only occasionally.
John, you'll have to wait for the book, John.
John, can I have a word, John? Are you hearing me?
Raoul, Elena's got a hand up. It's been up for a while. If we do Elena and then you.
Absolutely. I think Elena has to.
Okay, Elena, you go ahead.
Hi, first, thank you very much for the talk. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on whether or not it's possible to introduce the Wu Wei into regulatory processes so that things that need to be left alone are left alone. I think one of the best examples here is the peat bogs in Canada, which are storing an awful lot of carbon and which are also home to a vast ecosystem of plants and animals. Is there any way we can sort of shoehorn that into regulatory thinking?
Regulatory thinking. I don't know. I mean, give us a clue, Elena. You're the expert on things like that.
Well, for example, I think that the protection of various areas like waterways, bogs, parts of the ocean is one way where if we wanted to exploit something, rather than having to prove that it shouldn't be done, of having to prove that it should be done.
Prove that it should be done.
You know, kind of a reversal of the legal structure where, you know, you're supposed, before you convict somebody, you're supposed to prove beyond the reasonable doubt that a crime has been committed. And I'm saying, you know, can we prove by beyond at least a preponderance of evidence that something should be done when it involves so many trade-offs, like the peat, for example, that they want to mine the minerals in the Ring of Fire, which is a lot of the peat bog up here in Canada. But the minerals that they get out would not, in their use, reduce as much carbon as the peat is now holding.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can't think of anything very constructive to say about that. I mean, you can look at the situation and say, you know, this looks like a mistake, and what it promises to do for you is much less than the damage that it's going to do. I try to include in my talk examples of letting go, relying on the agency of nature rather than trying to dominate it. But I don't know how to add anything to what you just said, really.
Okay, well, we rapidly come to the end. Raoul still has a question.
It's just an observation, and thank you very much for your presentation. I think there is something that we can call the Ashby space, that is where resources and possible actions are connected. And I was wondering whether when we reach chaotic situations, chaos, the next situation is highly complex situations, which you have related to Stafford's work, and later and beyond that you have the operational side. So there is three levels: the chaotic level, chaos, which has something like a fly in Brazil producing a storm in the United States. You have the problems of highly complex situations, which are the ones that relate to organizations. And then you have the problems, the operational problems, which more or less are related to your ecosystemic situations. Do you see a connection between these three levels and possible mechanisms to connect them?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've entirely understood this question either. Exceedingly complex systems, as Beer called them. It's also the level of wicked problems.
And that complexity is something that we manage with organizations, don't we?
I think sometimes we get away with what Bateson called lineal tricks, right? That was the start of the talk. And for me, that means sometimes we find what I call islands of stability in the endless flux of becoming.
Yeah.
And sooner or later, and they involve this kind of performance success that I talked about at the beginning of my talk. That's the way I think about the world in general. Certainly islands of organization, social organization, is the creation of islands of stability in the social world.
Andrew, can I just try to complete my question? What I'm wondering is whether you see some mechanisms connecting chaotic situations to organizational situations, to operational situations, are the ones that you were trying to explain through the examples that you gave.
Attempts at a certain kind of cybernetic control of the material world.
I think that we lost him in the last minute.
Oh dear.
Oh dear, Andrew, are you still hearing us or not?
Oh yes, he's back again.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, the connections.
The connection hasn't been brilliant, no.
No, sorry.
Okay, well, maybe this is a good time to draw it to a close. Angela, do you want to conclude?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, Raul, that the last moment, the last conversation, we couldn't complete it. But anyway, it's been
Yes,
brilliant.
but I thought it was very valuable to the connections that Andrew was doing, but we can talk with him later on. Thank you.
Yes,
Please,
Hope
please.
so,
Yeah.
I'm sure. So anyway, thank you again, Andrew. I think that it was fascinating and full of food for thought for all of us. So thank you for being with us. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for being here and thank you for the feedback.
Thank you
I'm
for
so
listening.
sorry about the connection.
No, it was
I
good.
blame the university.
We managed to communicate. It was mostly all right.
Right.
Okay. Yes, so thank you very much, Andrew. It was
Thank you. Goodbye.
great.
Thank you. Goodbye.
See you in May with Peter Robertson, okay?
Yes, definitely. Yes, I'll definitely be here for that.
Okay,
Okay.
great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.